The focus of the German photographer Michael Wolff's work is human life in megacities. Many of his projects document the architecture and the vernacular culture of metropoli. Wolff grew up in Canada, Europe, and the United States, studying at UC Berkeley and the Folkwang School with Otto Steinert in Essen, Germany. He moved to Hong Kong in 1994, where he worked for 8 years as contract photographer for Stern magazine. Since 2001, Wolff has been focusing on his own projects, many of which have been published as books. He won first prize in the World Press Photo Award competition on 2 occasions, 2005 and 2010. That's a nice pacing. And an honorable mention in 2011. In 2010 and again in 2017, he was shortlisted for the Prix Pictet Photography Prize. And I'm particularly, personally, honored to have him here because his work happens to grace the cover of my next book called Civilization. Francis, an old friend, is professor in the culture of photography at the University of Brighton, having established himself as a critical writer on photography. And boy, can he be tough. He always struck terror into my heart when he walked into one of my exhibitions. He was for some time the writer on photography for the Financial Times, having previously been a frequent contributor both to the broadsheet and the specialized press on the subject. He has separately held a number of senior posts in businesses centered on photography. He's been the head of photographs department at Sotheby's and creative director of Photonica and Image Source, which are both large commercial photo libraries. He's a co-founder of the leading photography prize, the Prix Pictet, on which he has twice served as chairman of on the panel of judges. He has also been chairman of judges on the Sony World Photography Awards, has judged the Jerwood Awards, British Journal of Photography Awards, and AOP Awards, among others. So welcome our 2 guests, and let's sit back and enjoy a stimulating conversation.
Thanks, Jim.
The mics are working? Great. Okay, yes, as Bill said, my name is Michael Wolff. I'm a photographer / artist. My practice has grown out of photography the past 4 or 5 years. I'm an obsessive collector of objects, which I often combine in installations. And I've been living in Hong Kong for the past 23 years. So it's the place that I've lived the longest in my life. And I'm actually a proponent of going deep into things rather than superficially. So I'm a bit reluctant to travel. I just like going and peeling the onion in Hong Kong more and more and more. And I think after 20 years, I've put together a body of work which I think is important for the city because it's changing so rapidly through urban renewal. There's a lot of documents there which I think in 20 years will be like Auger when he photographed Paris, which is also giving us clues how life was like during that time. And I think with my work in Hong Kong, because I started quite early, and there are very few other photographers documenting the life there. So I think I'm contributing something to Hong Kong's legacy as well. Usually when I give my talks, I show about 180 slides, and the format is different. I only talk about the genesis of each project. What I've done today is to reduce it to 53 slides, only 4 or 5 images from every topic. And I'm going to go relatively quickly through it because the format of this talk is going to be a dialogue between Francis and me, or I? Francis and me. So, and we haven't really prepared. We met yesterday for an hour and just discussed because we needed to catch up. So we're just going to improvise. But I'm sure Francis is a very entertaining question person. So I'm curious what he's going to ask. So this is a project I did as my university thesis in 1976. I spent a year in a German coal mining town close to Essen, Germany, and it had only 800 inhabitants, and it had very clearly defined borders, a canal, train tracks, and a big through road. So it was more or less a triangle, and it was, for me, it was incredibly good because it gave me very clear defined borders. I didn't have to figure out where do I go, how far do I go. Basically, I stayed in this triangle for a year and did a, do I have to point this somewhere?
Point at the computer.
There we go. It's on the timer, I think. It doesn't let me manually do it. No, but then I have to always say that's not the deal that we made. The deal that we made is that I can do it myself. I don't like always talking to you, please advance. There we go. Yeah. And I pointed towards you? Okay. So I spent a year there and basically tried to cover all aspects of life from children, birth, old age, working class people, what they work, what their hobbies are. And it turned out to be a very comprehensive project, and 30 years later, my publisher decided to make a book out of it. So I went into the coal mines, of course, and where the women worked. And I was 22 years old at the time. Strongly influenced by a certain form of humanistic photography. This is a project I started as a photojournalist. I'm fascinated by chairs. Fascinated by the improvised chairs. In Asia, you rarely throw something away if it's still useful. You always repair it. And there are chairs there which are, for me, they're all unique, and they all have character. They're like an old person where you can see in his face his life experience. And they're just marvelous improvisations. And this I started in 1996 or so because I was working for Stern magazine, and I went to China 6 months out of the year. And from every trip, I would bring back 2 or 3 chairs. So I have a very big collection of these. And they're beautiful. Aesthetically, they're beautiful. In 2003, my contract with Stern magazine ended, and SARS came to Hong Kong. 246 people died. My wife got scared and said, I have to leave, especially after the father of my son's best friend died, and she said, it's too close. And I realized that I'd been living in a city and I hadn't photographed it. And as everyone knows, a good photographer always does a personal project where he lives. And I said, you go, it was April 2003, you go back to Germany, I'm going to stay here and photograph my Hong Kong, which I hadn't done for 8 years. And architecture of density was the first facet of that. And the interesting thing about these, I'm using a stylistic device which I call no exit photography. You can see there's no sky and no horizon, so basically you have no idea how big these buildings actually are. They could be 10 times as big, or they could end just above where I cropped it, but your eye can't leave the picture. And in that sense, they turn into a metaphor for megacities. I'm an obsessive collector, and at some point I decided to do an installation called The Real Toy Story. It's an installation with 20,000 toys made in China, 45 square meters in size, and embedded into this installation are portraits of toy factory workers. This is the whole installation in The Hague, which is now traveling through Europe. At the moment, it's in Milan at the Fondazione Stelline, and then it's going to Hamburg. But it's 45 square meters in size, and it's quite, it took me four weeks to collect them, and then I had to file them all down, put magnets on them. 100 by 100 basically came as a reaction to my showing architecture of density, because I was always asked the question, how do people live in these high-rises? I mean, they're just like beehives. And I decided to do a project about interiors, and I was very lucky because I discovered a social housing estate, Hong Kong's oldest social housing estate in Shep Kip Mei, with over 400 apartments. And the interesting thing was that every apartment had the same floor plan, 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet. So I ended up photographing 124 different apartments. I boiled it down to 100, hence the title 100 by 100. And it's more an exercise in sociology. I always ask the inhabitant to sit in the middle of the room without an expression. And it's very interesting when you have all 100, because you can see what do rooms have in common, what is the common color. It's this Hong Kong red. They all have a rice cooker, a fan, a clock. So I usually show all 100 together. In 2006, I was invited to Chicago, which frightened the hell out of me because I'd never worked outside of Asia, to be artist in residence and photograph Chicago. And I knew I couldn't repeat what I had done in Hong Kong with architecture of density. And architecture of density is more about surface. And in Chicago, I decided to do it about transparency, about looking into buildings and seeing what's going on. So, I mean, here you see Hitchcock's Rear Window on the TV screen on the right there. So I'm observing the observer. The corner offices. This was right before the big financial crisis, so there were a lot of worried bankers. So basically, I always photographed from 5:30 until 6:45, when you had this magic hour where it was still light enough to see the facade, but dark enough to look into the windows. And I always got onto rooftops, so I basically had 4 directions where I could photograph from. In 1995, Stern Magazine sent me to Tokyo to do a reportage about the sarin gas attacks, the Om sect. And I rode a lot of subway, and I came to one subway station where it was possible to get very close to the windows opposite of where the people entered the train. So I could basically get within 4 feet of the window. And I took 8 pictures at that time, 1995. And I thought, at some point I'm going to do a project. And in 2010 I had some time. I have a folder at home, projects, possible projects, and I took out these 8 slides. I had someone research the train station, where that was, because I couldn't remember. It took her 2 or 3 weeks to find it. And I went there 4 years in a row, always for 1 month, and I spent the time from 7:30 until 8:45 at that same train station for 20 days, so Monday to Friday for 4 weeks. And I was so fascinated by it that I decided to do it every year. So in the end, I did it 4 years in a row, and I published 4 books, and each book is an improvement, I think, upon the last. We always exchanged 20 pictures out of 60 because I thought they were better than the ones in the previous book. So now we have 4 books. And again, this is a metaphor for life in cities. It's not really about the individual here. It's more about the living conditions, which are quite hellish. If you can imagine doing something like this day in and day out for 30, 35 years, it's quite horrific. My son and wife moved to Paris. My wife was fed up with Hong Kong in 2008, and I was commuting between Hong Kong and Paris, but I'd never really done a project there. And I ended up doing 2. One in the beginning when I just arrived, and one at the end. In Paris Rooftops I did in 2007. I just decided to go up and see Paris like we usually don't see it. So I did a series called Paris Rooftops, which I just found fascinating because of their geometry. The rounds, the triangles, the diagonals. So again, it's something else. It's different than architecture of density, and it's different than the transparent city again. This I did also in 2006. It's a project called Real Fake Art. Very close to Hong Kong, across the border in China, there's a small village with 5,000 artists whose specialty is copying contemporary and Renaissance art, and it's mainly for hotels and Walmart for the big shopping malls. And they have huge databases of over 100,000 paintings, and you go through their database and you say, I want that one and that one and that one. And I published a book where you always have the price that I paid for it. This is Ed Rouchet, I think, and it's Euro 570, and the price is usually based on the size of the canvas and the amount of paint used. It has nothing to do with the painting itself. Francis Bacon. But if you look at the photographs, the secret is really that I didn't, and always the person holding it is in some way involved, either the gallerist or the painter. But for me, it was important the location where I took the portrait. And you can see here, this is basically a pope who's throwing up. But I found a place where you have all this plastic stuff caught in the wiring, and here you have someone who had thrown up, really. So there's some correlation. Richard Prince, and that was basically the difficulty. The portrait wasn't so difficult, but finding the location to take the portrait of the person holding the painting was a challenge. Whoops. Richter. When I came to Paris, I really came there in 2008. I came there very begrudgingly. I found Paris to be quite like a Hollywood movie set, very samey everywhere, and I thought, I was used to this visual chaos of Hong Kong, and I thought, what am I going to do there? The privacy laws are very strict. Anyone can sue you. You're not allowed to photograph into windows. My God, if I photographed the people on the opposite side of where we lived, I would have immediately had a lawsuit had I published them. And so it was a bit childish. I just refused to go out, more or less. And I discovered the Google Street View platform, which was relatively new at the time. I think it came out second half of 2007. And I just decided, instead of going out and exploring the city by foot, I would just explore all of Paris street by street using Google Street View. And then the next step, of course, was to set up a tripod and a camera and start photographing the Google Street View images, but not in total. I would crop, and I would use the interface. And it's just amazing the interesting situations one comes across, illicit meetings of lovers. This is, of course, a famous photograph, a reference to a famous photograph by Robert Doisneau. A lot of, I did a whole book called Fuck You, FY, of only people giving the finger to the camera, and also to me in a way, so it has a bit of a double meaning. And just odd things like this, I mean, like some monster coming out of the ocean. Oops. It's go up? Okay. Yeah, and just odd things like this. I did a book called A Series of Unfortunate Events, ASOUE, where I just photographed strange accidents. Oh, I see, okay, yeah, no, it's my fault. And since 2003 until this day, I'm working on a project called Informal Solutions. In Hong Kong, you have, behind every main street, behind the buildings, there's a back alley, and these back alleys are basically sort of a wild area where you can do anything you want. All the kitchens open up to the back, and the workmen park their carts and their gloves and their mops. And it's this constant flux of informal arrangements. And I usually go out almost every day, and when I get off the bus, I always take the back alleys through all of Hong Kong because it's always changing. It's sort of an organic situation, and I've done 10 books to date. I've sort of structured it: Hong Kong flora, informal seating arrangements, Hong Kong storage. So I broke it down, deconstructed it, and this is, for instance, examples of flora in the back alleys. I did rubber boots and shoes because all the workmen take off their shoes when they come, and they balance them and put them in the evenings. They put them up again. Pipes. In Hong Kong, all the pipes are laid above the concrete because it never freezes. So you have these incredible, mesmerizing constellation of pipes there, which you never see in Europe in this form. Mops. I mean, they're just a myriad of ways of drying a mop. You can see you balance them, you hang them. Gloves. Everybody uses gloves there. In the evenings they're washed out and they're hung up, also in many different ways. Gloves, again. So, I think that's given you a quite comprehensive, in short form, an overview of all the topics that I've worked on since 2003, more or less.
I think that's wonderful. I think we sit here and enjoy the show. But I want to start by asking you about something you wrote about yourself, which is that one day you went to look at a man who'd built one of those chairs, and you photographed it. I think you were planning to come back and buy it. And you discovered that in between your photographing it and coming back to see it, you wrote this yourself in your recent book.
Right.
The police had come and they'd said to the poor man, your chair gives a bad impression of China. Your chair is not a good chair. And he was threatened and asked to remove it, and he was told that it was not a social act to encourage this foreigner to...
Mind you, it was 2 weeks before Clinton visited China in Beijing.
But still, it seems to me quite an interesting place to start, that at some level, with the best possible intention, your picture potentially did some harm to that person, or at least to put him in a position where he might have some awkwardness explaining himself. Mm-hmm. And pictures do that. Pictures can be beneficial and they can also be quite damaging. Is there a point at which you have to be indifferent to those effects to make yourself the photographer you are? I mean, the other question I could ask you of the same kind is you're poking your lens in other people's windows, you're incredibly sensitive when you photograph the interiors in Hong Kong, and then you switch that off to photograph people who haven't seen you through dusk, lighting. Is there simply a switch that you switch off and you say, I have to do this in the interests of the work that I'm building? And if the police come to a man in Canton, Hong Kong I think it was, and cause an embarrassment, that's an unfortunate side effect? Or is it something you'd rather never happened?
No, I found this experience with the chair was actually quite interesting. It was really the very beginning when I started photographing the chairs. I collected them and then I decided it would be interesting to also photograph them. And I found this wonderful chair. I mean, it was the grandmother or grandfather of all chairs, a big armchair, and it was missing a leg, and they'd used a spindle from a textile factory to support one, bricks to support the other leg. The back leg was splinted with a piece of board. It had a weird cover on top. It was simply beautiful, and it was the guy who owned it he was selling soy milk. And I remember setting up my tripod, and I was still photographing analog at the time, and I'd framed the picture, and then suddenly all the hairs on my neck stood up, and it was eerie, and I turned around, and there was a group of 20 to 30 older people behind me staring at me, and they were getting very angry, and my interpreter was saying, let's pack up and get out of here because they think you're making fun of China. The idea was basically, why don't you photograph new chairs and show that we're a modern country and not photograph this rubbish, more or less. And it was impossible to explain my intention. They just couldn't make that leap. And so I packed up my tripod and I left, and then 6 hours later I thought maybe it would be interesting always to photograph take a portrait of the chair owner in the chair. And so I backtracked and went back, and lo and behold, the chair was gone. And as Francis mentioned, my interpreter asked, "Where's the chair?" And he said, "Right after you left, the public security came and they smashed the chair to 1,000 bits." And for me, it was really the first time I realized that photography, by drawing attention to something, on the one hand, it can preserve, that photograph will be around for all prosperity, forever more or less, unless, the files explode. But by my paying so much attention to the singular object, I also caused its destruction. And it was something I could never have imagined, but it was a lesson, and that's why I included this anecdote in the book. I understand your point about Chicago, and I researched it as well, because as I mentioned before, in Paris it would simply be impossible, because everyone has the right to their own picture. But I have a lawyer friend in San Francisco, and basically if you're photographing for artistic purposes, you can do that in America. The people cannot sue. I mean, if they don't want to be photographed, they can close their curtains. So I felt, because I remember before I left for Chicago, I said I was deathly frightened because I was so used to Asia and to the working conditions there. I know the visual grammar of Hong Kong, for instance, probably better than anyone else. I know exactly what this means and why the gloves are there and things like that. And suddenly I was going to go to Chicago. And I remember sitting there one night and thinking, shit, I'm going to be up on these rooftops with a telephoto this big and a lens and a black hood over my head, and within 5 minutes you're going to have Homeland Security wrestling me to the ground, and I'm going to end up in Guantanamo because someone's going to phone and say there's a guy with a bazooka on the rooftop. And I was seriously thinking of abandoning the project because you don't want to mess with this stuff. But by the time you...
These are legal pivots, and very interesting legal pivots. I want to ask you about a different thing, which is the pivot of the audiences that you made in your career, where you went from being a very distinguished journalistic photographer covering the whole of Asia, getting stories and bringing them back to an audience out there, to doing something really completely different. And all photographers worry about these distinctions between the kind of audiences that we serve with different kinds of... How much of that Stern experience do you still have in your boots at the moment? How much of that experience, are you still telling stories? You told me once ages ago that you learnt from Otto Steinert that everything had to be divided into 6 pictures. And if you had 6 good pictures that were different enough but they still told a story, why, you'd beat the competition. You'd get the story that week. And you had to have a lead story, and then 4 pictures that told the story, and then a wrapper at the end. And you might get a double-page spread 6 times, would be a good discipline for journalism.
That's the top you can get.
Steinert was not really a journalist all his career, but he certainly knew how to be a journalist. Has it stayed with you, that thing of getting the story right in a few pictures? You talked today about going back to places again and again and again. Is it because the story isn't finished until you're happy that it's finished? For old-fashioned journalistic reasons?
No, of course. I mean, I worked as a photojournalist for 25 years, and I worked on a lot of stories. And during the 70s and 80s until the mid-90s, more or less, the budgets were huge. I mean, Stern Magazine had unlimited resources, and I would work for 3 to 4 months on a story, traveling all through China. And they were marvelous working conditions until the whole print media market collapsed around 2002, 2003. But this narrative storytelling is in my blood. The difficulty I found transitioning from photojournalism to art was more a formal one, because in the beginning I found myself, after 25 years of working for Stern, which has a certain aesthetic and a certain way of framing pictures, every time I would lift my camera, I would immediately frame the picture like a Stern double page. And I knew I couldn't do that because in 2003, when I started with thinking about getting into the art market, selling photojournalism just wasn't possible. They wanted something else. So basically, I had to retrain my way of looking. And my role model was Michael Schmidt, who did the very famous book, Waffenruhe, Truce, who basically used a very low depth of field. He worked with a medium format camera on a tripod. And for half a year, and Michael was a friend of mine, and I own some of his work, and Waffenruhe is one of my all-time favorite books. And I basically took his book and went into the back alleys with my tripod and my medium format camera and replicated his images. Not the subject matter, because his subject matter was the Berlin Wall, but just the style, that you focus on something in the foreground and the background. So I had to basically retrain 25 years of automatic seeing as a photojournalist in double pages into making single pictures. You know, I didn't have to worry about the gatefold. In Stern, you always worry about the gatefold, that you don't have something in the center. So it took me quite a while, but it was a very good exercise, and it really helped me in my career. Also, that all the pictures are straight. In Stern magazine, they don't care if you tilt the camera. But if you look at my photographs, you'll find that they're all absolute parallel lines, which is really important, that you have this homogeneity in your images when you look at them.
I don't want to get stuck talking about labels, but I do just want to ask you. We know that there came out of post-war German photography something called the Düsseldorf School, and we know that you're not in it and that you act in opposition to it. Are you conscious that you've got to see things in a different way? Are you conscious that you want to identify, if you like, a different style or brand or type of imagery that competes with that very now successful and well-known and to some extent rather weary school of looking? Or is it just that that's not where you went to school?
It's interesting because I never considered it. And Düsseldorf and Essen are 45 kilometers apart.
Yeah.
And both my parents studied at the art academy in Munich. They studied art. My father calligraphy, my mother ceramics. And it somehow should have been a natural that I apply in Düsseldorf. But I was so interested in photojournalism because it gave me an excuse to put my nose into places and my eye into places where I normally wouldn't get into. And I really took a liking to it. I originally came to Essen just to go for a year. I was studying at UC Berkeley, but then I fell in love with photojournalism, and I knew this is a profession I want to exercise. There's a very interesting anecdote. I took real fake art to the Ludwig Museum in Cologne. And I prepared a wonderful box of 40 portraits of the artists with the paintings, and there were two curators there. One came from the Agfa Gewert Museum, and I can't remember where the other one came from. And they looked at the pictures, and they were just enthralled. And they said, if it's the last thing I do before I retire, we're going to show this project. And they even showed me the room. And they said, leave the box with me, and I'll show it to Caspar Koenig and to the chief curator. And so I flew back to Hong Kong, and I waited, and then 2 months later, the box was returned with a letter, very short letter. It said, "Dear Michael, I'm afraid this exhibition is not going to happen." We showed it to the chief curator. The first question she asked is, where did he study? And I said, at the Folkwang School. She said, wrong school. So it shows two things. One, I mean, German is a very hierarchical place. You know, the mailman doesn't talk with the professor. And where you study, it's a stigma. I mean, photojournalism wasn't considered art. It was considered a craft. And there are a lot of curators who, to this day, if you say I studied at the Folkwang School, they won't even look at your work. It's insane, and that's why I'm so glad America is a much more democratic and open place. They really don't care where you study.
Up to a point, Michael. To a point.
My career started in America because of the openness of the gallerists.
let me jump a bit. I want to ask you about collecting, because I think that, well, I think lots of things, but I think there are two different kinds of photographer at root. And one of them wants to accumulate stuff, and in the same way that you buy the chairs that you see as well as making photos, you're a small boy at one level, if you don't mind my putting it that way. You like that thing of collecting another example, and a good one, and you stack things up, and you own a lot of these things.
Yeah.
A lot of the real fake art you've bought, I know.
I bought them all.
You bought them all, I didn't know that, but I knew you had some. If you're a great collector, even, dare I use the word, obsessive collector, if you're hoarding stuff...
Please use the word obsessive, because it's true.
How does that make room for your viewers to come into the collection? I'm interested in the mechanism whereby you've become a great communicator to other people by dint of allowing your obsession to take charge and to keep on getting another one. And you talk about your timetable, your very fierce timetable of going back to Shinjuku Station for 4 weeks at exactly the rush hour and doing it again next year and doing it again the year after that. What happens where this quite private activity, this quite, if you don't mind my putting it this way, quite eccentric activity, becomes something for us all? Where's the flip? Where does it become something that has actually acquired a meaning beyond the small boy collecting a different kind of beetle and putting it in his matchbox, and that's private? Somewhere these things become of interest as great communication tools, whereas at the beginning I don't think they're quite that. They're something else.
No, if you look at my retrospective, it's actually quite interesting. There's a wonderful catalog which my publisher and I published together. In the beginning, I really only photographed, but parallel to photographing, I always collected things. And one of the wonderful things of quitting photojournalism, and I didn't realize that at first, I was really scared. You know, I was 50 years old, and it was as if someone had pulled the rug out. Stern magazine, the circulation went back by 50%, and I thought, you know, the day rates instead of 500 euros dropped to 200 euros, and I thought, how can I support my son, my wife, my travels? It's impossible. And I thought, okay, I have a lot of ideas, and I just decided to try to get into the art and publishing market. And my wife gave me 2 years, basically. She said, I'll give you a 2-year grace period where you really don't have to earn money, but after that, you'll have to get a normal job like anyone else. and do that. And since I'd always collected, and the thing is, after I was very lucky. In 2004, I found a gallery, and basically my career took off. But what I quickly realized is the enormous sense of freedom that I have as an artist. As a photojournalist, you are always bound to two-dimensional pictures on a double page. And you have a very specific audience. And as an artist, I had total freedom. I could do whatever I wanted. Of course, the result had to be sales, otherwise I couldn't live. But I was very lucky. I sold quite from the start. And I found wonderful gallerists, all of whom I'm still with today. But I also had the freedom to do what, I could go and collect 20,000 toys and spend half a year working on an installation, which would have been impossible as a photojournalist. And as my career progressed, I started thinking about making exhibitions more interesting rather than just photographs. I started introducing the chairs. At the beginning, I would put the chairs on pedestal in the middle of the museum and surround it with the portraits of the chairs. And then at a later stage, I started introducing these objects into the installation on the wall. So I would hang a small chair in the middle of the photographs. Then I started filming. I call them 30-second photographs, and I would go into the back alleys. And every time I saw something where movement and time was involved, I would take a 30-second film, and I would make monitors the same size as the photographs, and you would suddenly have 5 moving pictures in an installation of 60 images, plus 5 coat hangers, which I found in back alleys, plus 2 chairs, plus a glove. So the whole thing became much more complex than just pictures, and I loved it. I mean, for me, it was like paradise, and I always say in my talks, I'm not a conceptual photographer, I'm not an intellectual. I always say my brain follows my gut. And I do everything I do is purely instinctive. I go out. I remember when I collected these chairs in the 90s, my wife would always roll her eyes and said, you know, what are we going to do with this stuff? It's cluttering things up. And I said, Barbara, don't worry about it. Something will come of it. And indeed, I think it was 8 months later, I realized that these chairs were a metaphor for life in China, for the condition of China in the 90s. The state-owned enterprises, the SOEs, were going bankrupt. People were sitting around outside. The people were thrifty. They never threw anything away. So it revealed a lot about the character of the Chinese.
You've exceptionally elegantly not answered the question, but that's completely your privilege.
That's fair.
Let me just, no, we'll even in the declining days of Stern magazine, they sold a million copies of each issue.
Under 700,000 now.
So it's now under 700,000. But you go now to the new world that we live in, and your books, I suppose you'd be lucky to sell 5,000 or 6,000 copies of a book. Would that be right? Slightly more than that?
Depends on the book.
And then when you go to a show, we all know this, that a photographic show is seen by 300 people or 200 people or something, unless it's huge, and that's very rare. There's a way in which you've swapped a huge audience that didn't much care that it was you telling these stories for a smaller audience that begins to follow this chronological development and who looks for your next project and looks for the same ideas appearing in their developed form in the way that we know an artist does. Where does your audience sit in the beginning of the formulation of each new project? You used to have some editor who shouted down the phone at you, we've got to go and do some bridges, they're building big bridges in China all over the place. It's infrastructure's in this month. And now you sit around in back alleys looking at gloves until the gloves turn into something wonderful. Is there any sense that you're addressing an audience directly? Or are you just doing your thing and we, your fans, have come along behind?
That's exactly the way it is. I never think of my audience. I never strategize. I never think about what would be successful, what could sell or what could not sell. I purely do, and that's the freedom that I have as an artist. I do exactly that, what I want to do, and what comes from my instinct, what fascinates me. And fortunately, I mean, all of us are individuals, and we all see things differently. And fortunately, for some reason, I've managed to attract a large audience solely through the way I see things. And it's different. I mean, the Hong Kong back alleys are so banal, and 99.9% of the people my wife refuses to go in them. She said there are rats and cockroaches and it smells. But somehow I discovered this incredible evolving way of life there and made a topic out of it. And it was a huge hit in Hong Kong because the Hong Kong inhabitants had rarely gone in there.
You see, I think that's a photographic thing. I think you can both say the whole world has been photographed. Everything, we know everything through photographs. But you can also say that putting photographs into new worlds, I suppose what I think is that actually finding that there's great beauty in that three-legged stool, which you do and which you did, actually makes the stool important in a way that it wasn't important before. And that's a photographic thing. But it's also true that it's been very successful in your personal career, but it's a very odd thing to drag hundreds of people along down the back alleys I've said to people that you're a sociologist, I've said to people that you're a kind of urban anthropologist, you're of course still a reporter, you are a sculptor of some kind. All of these things, which you completely falsely say come from the gut and not from the brain, actually add up to a you're the only person who says things come from the gut and then immediately quotes the sources that I've heard you talking about sculptors in the connection of these things. If it comes from the gut, it's a very highly educated gut that you sit on. But still, there is a question in my mind about audience that you can't do these things because you're just collecting views of these things. At some level, the thing adds up to what, Michael? Is it an overview of Hong Kong? Is it a social critique of something rather large which comes out of these small bits? Is it a kind of Michael philosophy? Somewhere there's something that drives the whole.
It's a hybrid of all these things. I mean, it's part of my upbringing. My parents were both, my father was a professor of art and he was a liberal. He always took sides with the little man, with the working class people. They were morally and ethically very straight. And money was never a discussion at our table. He always said, find something you enjoy doing and do it, and don't worry about what you get paid. So it wasn't nowadays, go to Goldman Sachs as an analyst and you'll be rich. That was never a topic. So it's partially my upbringing. It's partially that at some point I realized I see things differently and uniquely versus how other people see things. I mean, the chairs, it's not only the photographs. I traveled a lot with different journalists to mainland China because I didn't only work with one writer, I worked with maybe 10 writers altogether over a period of 8 years. And we got off the airplane, we rented a car, we drove somewhere into a village, and the first thing I would do is I'd tell it, stop, I'd tell the driver to stop because I spied a beautiful bastard chair standing there. And I'd say stop, and I'd go out and I'd look at it. And the writers in the beginning were totally perplexed. They said, what the hell are you doing? I mean, it's a broken chair. And then I would go and explain to them why I find them so beautiful. And often they were relatively small chairs. And I'd say, look how it's been repaired 5 times, and look at this covering. And it's a unique object. It's like looking at an elderly person whose life is etched on his face, the folds. And I swear to God, every journalist with whom I traveled ended up taking a chair back with them to Germany. It wasn't the photograph. It was just suddenly giving this object a context and seeing it from a different angle and seeing the beauty in it rather than seeing just a broken chair. And it's the same with the back alleys. I mean, they're filthy, smelly places. But if you isolate these wonderful installations that you can find there that are constantly evolving and changing, they're like ready-made Duchamp sculptures. They're absolutely fascinating.
And indeed, there are people who've arrived at something not dissimilar through sculpture. I think in England, I think of Richard Wentworth, for example, who's collected sculptures of a kind of vernacular street kind.
Exactly.
But he comes from a tradition of sculpture to something not a million miles dissimilar to what you're finding. There's something, but I asked you about the overview of the whole thing. You've just done a pretty big retrospective book. You're just doing a pretty big retrospective show. Are you beginning to see that these things add up to some kind of critique of this? I mean, World Press level, at Pictet Prize level and so forth, everybody's looking to see some judgment about everything. And as far as I know, you've always denied that there's any overview. You've always said, this is just the next project, I feel like to. And the Google Images one you said to us just now, you said it was childish, you were sulking, you stayed indoors.
Right.
There's no theory there. There's just a man who doesn't want to go to Paris because Paris has been photographed too much.
But for some reason, all my projects interlinked. And you can argue maybe real fake art is sort of on the periphery, but they all have some relationship towards one another, but it wasn't something which I strategized beforehand. It just so happened. And there is, on a certain level, there's critique involved. Architecture of density is really a criticism of this extremely inhuman architecture. 100 by 100 criticizes the size.
Yeah, it's the same, of course.
Tokyo compression criticizes the downside. It shows the downside of big city life.
Of course it does. And Tokyo compression, of all of those things, Tokyo compression is the one which is easiest read as metaphor.
Right.
And those people are kind of bleeding out something in that condensation on the windows, which is they've lost their soul. They're crushed spiritually as well as being crushed in the rush hour. Everybody sees that, but I'm asking you whether it adds up to something which is a kind of. We know that photographers who stick with one thing throughout their career are often thought to have one very clear banner that they fly, which is a political or social point that is theirs. And you flipped around from subject to subject, and yet I still see this great interest in mass humanity, a kind of pollution of cities. These are very closely related things that you've stayed with all the time.
Right.
And then in each case, there's a great optimism about the way people muddle through. And people come up with good solutions to things. And your mops, or even your people in Chicago working away in these appalling corner offices where they're all doing exactly the same thing. And they just show little bits of you. How much of that has become your way of thinking?
Well, it obviously is my way of thinking. Otherwise, I wouldn't photograph it like that. I'd photograph it totally differently. So basically, I've learned to trust myself and to trust my instincts and go with them. I'm just, at the moment, the past 6 weeks, I've really been thinking about Marina Abramović, who I find her one of the great artists, one of the great living artists of today. And I read her biography by James Lescott last week, and there's one sentence which she said which struck me. She says, "I never do a project which I'm not afraid of, because then I don't test my limits. If I think of an idea and I feel very comfortable with it, oh, that's easy to do, I won't do it." For me, it's not quite that way. Chicago was, as I mentioned, I was deathly afraid of, but I basically just, and I think that's the wonderful thing about being an artist. You have this tremendous amount of freedom. You can go in any direction you like, which at Stern Magazine, I was always under the thumb of the director of photography and of the art director. And I knew the rules. I had to abide by the rules. Otherwise, my contract, I had a yearly contract, my contract wouldn't be renewed. And so I sort of internalized that whole thing. And then when this 2003, when the contract ended, as I mentioned in the beginning, I was afraid, but then I just went with it. And I mean, all my stories, the genesis of them, they're all very personal. The real Toy Story is very interesting because we emigrate, my father and mother are German, we emigrated to the United States in 1955. And they were very German, and they hated a lot of the American way of life, especially all the plastic. So at Christmas time, we never got plastic toys. All my friends, they got Kens and Barbies and all this so-called, my parents called it trash. And I just, and my father, he was a good woodworker. He always made me these beautiful handmade wooden things. For instance, a rocking horse. Or once he made me a shooting gallery. It was a box with 3 dowels in it, and he hand-carved the animals, a giraffe, an elephant, a parakeet, beautiful silhouettes, and then he put a tin heart on them, and they were mounted on the dolls, and when you hit them with a BB gun, they would fall over. I mean, it was just a marvelous
present. Yeah, it's wonderful.
A wonderful present, but I didn't appreciate it because I wanted what the other kids were getting. And then in 2003, my son and my wife and I went to America to visit my parents, and they went away for 3 days to Canada to visit some friends, and I was there alone. And I'm a habitual flea market and Salvation Army goer because I always like just rummaging around, and I always find.
I don't think anybody in this room is surprised to hear you say that right now.
And this time I went to the Salvation Army shop, and serendipitously there was this huge bag standing by the counter filled with plastic toys. And I literally felt like a heroin addict who'd been dry for 20, 30 years and suddenly finding a little pile of heroin. And I said, "How much is it?" She said, $5, you can have it. And I took this huge bag, put it into the car, and sort of said, I can't wait to dump it out when I get home. Because it still was, mind you, this was 2003, so I was almost 50. And it was this memory of being a child and not being able to have this. And I said, oh, now, I'm an adult. My parents can't say no. I brought it home, I dumped it out, and I just felt this feeling of satisfaction. And then I suddenly came up with the idea. I said, my son, who was 6 at the time, or 7, I thought, why don't I just put all these toys in the living room on all the pieces of furniture, you know, on the armrest, on the table. And I did that. 600 toys isn't very many, but still, it was quite a wonderland. And then when my son came back, I blindfolded him in front of the door, guided him into the living room. I said, Jasper, who's sitting right there, I said, Jasper, take off your blinds. And he took them off, and he goes, wow. It was this amazing reaction. And that's where the moment came to do an installation. And I started doing calculations. I put the 600 toys together, and they were 1.5 meters square. And I thought 600 toys, you know, it's just not going to work. I calculated it up, and I said, if I do something like this, it has to be enormous and overwhelming. And then I came up with a sum of 20,000. And I figured out it would be about 450 square feet, and that's a good chunk of wall. It's a good chunk of space, and it worked. When I show it in Hamburg now, they've asked me to increase the size by 50%, so it'll be 60 square meters. But that was the beginning of the installation. But then, if you look at many of my projects, they're always multi-layered. Architecture of density is paired with the work in the back alleys. Transparent SETI is paired with the details, which I cropped out of the windows, which are very pixelated. And I thought an installation with 20,000 toys, it might be overwhelming, but it's very simple. You know, it's 20,000 colorful toys. So that's where my background as a photojournalist kicked in, and I thought, why don't I combine this installation with portraits of the people who make the toys? And
it's not just because you're talking about toys, but I did want to ask you about humor, which many people forget that photographers use as a tool. And I don't know if it's just me, but I often find that many of your pictures are very funny.
Well, Informal solutions.
Yeah. And the Google Street Views, often very funny. Even some of the details in the interiors in Hong Kong, it's a thing. But I never hear people talking about photography carrying an element of humor. Yet in theatre or in pop music or in novels, we look for humor in the same. Right. Do you do it on purpose? Do you look for little jokes, little one-liners? Do you feel it's a way of communicating to us? Or is it just that sometimes these things are in the line of surrealist descent? They're vaguely obscure Dada gestures of that slightly pretentious kind.
I think it's...
How does humor work?
I'm very familiar with art history. I mean, I look at a lot of work, I studied it, and so obviously there are references there. And when I see something, I often say, oh, you know, that could be Marcel Duchamp, or it could be something else, you know, from the Dadaists. But I mean, the master of humor is Martin Parr. You know, he consciously goes for this form of irony and humor. But I don't do that. I mean, I don't go out and say, I'm going to look for something humorful. It just so happens that people find some of my things highly entertaining and interesting, and there is a touch of humor. But in that sense, I'm not consciously aware.
Using it.
I'm not using it.
Now listen, we've kind of run out of time. I think we've probably got time for a few questions, because
It's already finished.
You just did it.
What a pity.
You just ran through the time. Why don't we take just a few questions, because I'm sure people want to ask you things that I hadn't thought of, but we haven't got very much time. So let's just say 3 or 4 questions only, please. Go ahead. Can you speak loudly enough that the microphone could pick you up?
Well, in a sense, it's not letting go, because I kept going back. And the intention was really the first time to only do it once. But then when I looked at the pictures, I realized that the ones with the condensation were somehow more powerful than the ones where the window panes were absolutely clear. And then I thought, I looked at the dates when I photographed it, and I figured out when is the right season to do it. And I decided to go back because I thought I could improve upon it. And as Francis has mentioned, I'm a very obsessive person. I mean, it can sometimes go to the point of self-harm. I mean, I can't let go of things. And I did it as a photojournalist as well. If I found a good location and I took a good picture, I would return to that place 10 times because I had the feeling the more often I'm there, the chances are greater of some constellation of events happening to make a great picture, and that's the way I felt about Tokyo. And you're quite right. I went there. I'd still be going there today, but in 2013, I went there on March 11th, again intending to stay for 4 weeks. And then I saw posters on the Shimagatazawa station. I saw posters which said this train station is closing on March 25th because it was an overland. It was, that's why you have daylight. It was an overland, and everywhere when it crossed a street, the barriers came down. And so it was enormously disruptive for rush hour traffic. And so for over 15 years, they'd been building a tunnel underground all the way to Shinjuku Station. And I just so happened to come 14 days before, so I only had 14 days until, now it's not possible anymore because the light underground is horrible, it's fluorescent light, everything is green. The interesting thing about Tokyo compression is that you have the daylight and the reflections of the neon signs in the background. It's just a very beautiful light, but it's over. So it had a,
it's a wonderful answer, but we've got to let somebody else ask a question too. Are there any more questions, please, from you all? Otherwise, we'll stop. Is there one more question? Go ahead. Please go ahead.
So what's the next current obsession?
What's my current obsession? Well, let's put it this way. I mentioned before this peeling of the onion. And Hong Kong, much to the disappointment of my wife, I'm still not finished with Hong Kong. She's been living here in Germany now for quite a few years, and she desperately wants me to return. But I'm just someone who needs to work, and if I feel down, the best remedy for feeling that way is to go out. And I photograph every day. If it's only for 3 hours, I'll just get into a bus, get out somewhere, and start crisscrossing through the back alley. And it focuses me in the present, in the here and now, and that inner monologue, which we all know. When we're walking, we're all thinking about something in the future and the past. I sometimes need to be in the present, and photographing just focuses me on being here and observing my world now and not getting into some weird inner rat chase of anxiety. So photography, and in the end, it's something very productive. I know I'm doing something good for Hong Kong. I know I'm doing something good for me. And I know I have an audience who appreciates what I'm doing. So in that sense, it makes me feel good.
I think that lady asked you a very simple question. She's just discovered, as we all do, how wonderfully you don't answer questions when you don't want to. You've just met Michael Wolff, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed.